Hello everybody and welcome to today's video. I am going to be talking about Trails of Cold Steel today, as the fourth entry in the series has just been released, finally. I have been looking forward to playing that a great deal, but I promise that I'm not going to do any spoilers in this video. I have no idea how I'm actually going to write the review of the game, to be honest, since spoilers come in thick and fast from quite literally the opening moment. It's the fourth chapter in the series, hence Trails of Cold Steel 4, and it is a direct sequel to everything that has come before, so there is going to be a real problem to deal with this review. The video is not going to be about that game in itself though, but the series as a whole, because Trails of Cold Steel does occupy a fairly uncommon space in the JRPG genre, and it's worth talking about, I think. Trails of Cold Steel isn't unique because it's long. It is very infamously long. Each chapter is about 60 or so hours to work through, and the whole thing is 240 hours at minimum, to do some basic math there. But there are other long JRPGs out there. For example, Persona 5 clocks in at 120 odd hours in one game, and the Yakuza series is also very long across the entire series. But those games aren't really comparable to Trails of Cold Steel. For one thing, in almost every other case, I consider 60 hours to be the upper limit on what a JRPG narrative can achieve before it starts to feel like it's been padded out. I've spoken of my issues with Persona 5 before, for example. For me, the only reason that it is inferior to Persona 4 is that it has the equivalent narrative ideas and strength, but it spreads them and therefore dilutes them over twice the length of game. I have, through all my studies and professional life, believed that brevity is the mark of good writing and good storytelling, and if you can achieve something in half the length, then your work simply needs to have a lot of editing done to it before it's published to the best possible standard, and I think that certainly applies to Persona 5. It could have been half the length and been a much higher impact game as a result. And yet, I've never felt like Trails of Cold Steel is too long. I've never felt like any of the individual games or the series as a whole has been padded out. I do genuinely believe that this series justifies its 240 hours, if not more, runtime over 4 volumes, and I do think that cutting it back from that would actually compromise its thematic strength. Now, I've mused on why I feel this a great deal, because it is an outlier in terms of what I think games should be and should do. But I think that playing through the fourth chapter has really crystallized why I think this. Trails of Cold Steel has always been aesthetically and tonally more closely related to the historical epic in literature and film, the likes of Lawrence of Arabia, War and Peace, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and Taiko, than it has been related to a typical JRPG, and I think that that is why these games need to be that long. The RPG side of things, I mean, people often talk about Trails of Cold Steel as a JRPG, and quite a classical one because it's turn-based and traditional in its mechanics, but I think that that is looking at the games in perhaps the wrong light. It's looking at the quality of them that is secondary, because it's the themes and the narrative where this series really shines. So the first thing that you'll notice with the fourth chapter of Trails of Cold Steel is that there are a lot of characters. There is a half-hour opening cutscene at the start before you even really get to pick up the controller, and that cutscene introduces dozens and dozens and dozens of characters. You will know them all from previous titles, and I really have to stress that you have to play Trails of Cold Steel 4 after the previous 3. It's one of those games. You'll know all the characters that you're getting introduced to in this cutscene, and they'll all be quite familiar to you. But that one cutscene just crystallizes how many characters there are and brings it together and makes it very clear that, you know, over the course of half an hour, you're getting exposed to the full breadth of characters that have made up this very long narrative arc. And that cutscene was a bit of an aha moment to me, because it was the moment where I really realized that Trails of Cold Steel isn't trying to be a JRPG at all. There's just that the JRPG side of things is really just the structure that supports a historical fiction novel in any other way. I mean, it's interactive, but for all intents and purposes, this is a historical fiction novel. It is not a real-world history, it is a fantasy history, but it cribs everything stylistic about it from that genre rather than the JRPG. I've seen people critical of the Trails series, particularly this fourth chapter now that reviews are starting to come out for it, for having too many characters, and the perception is there that Neon Falcon, the developer, doesn't understand how to manage a very large ensemble cast. That is true, but only if you look at Trails as a traditional JRPG, where players are meant to have this intense relationship to each character, and those characters are meant to be kind of deep and nuanced characters that you build a very close connection to by being so constantly familiar with them over the course of a game. That is not really the point of the historical novel. By contrast, for the historical epic, it's the context and the conflict that is the real character of the novel and what you are really experiencing. It's not about individual characters, it's about what's happening to them and what's happening in the world around them. Romance of the Three Kingdoms, for example, has a few memorable characters like Lu Bu and Cao Cao, though I would suggest that they're probably more memorable because of the various games and other adaptations that have happened of that novel. The novel itself mixes those characters in with all the other characters, and beyond those two characters there are thousands of other characters whose role within the novel is really just to help contextualize the social, political and conflict environment for the audience. They're kind of they're a tool, really, quite transparently a tool to help structure the kind of the more important part of the narrative, which is the world around them. Now, I found a really neat analysis on the historical novel from the London Review of Books. I'll link to the article in the description below, but in the opening paragraph there's this really great quote that links Trails of Cold Steel to that literary genre. Not literally, I did the linking, but in reading that quote I found it applied to Trails of Cold Steel very clearly. Here's the quote. "The classical form of the historical novel is an epic depicting a transformation of popular life through a set of representative human types whose lives are reshaped by sweeping social forces. Famous historical figures will feature among the dramatis personae, but their roles in the tale will be oblique and marginal. Narratives will centre instead on middling characters of no great distinction, whose function is to offer an individual focus for the dramatic collision of opposing extremes between whom they stand and more often waver." Now, there are important lead characters in Trails of Cold Steel, of course, but this series, and the fourth chapter in particular, makes it clear that this story is all about all the characters, the middling characters that quote refers to, and not just the few that you have in your party as the main characters, or the targets of those parties' characters' quests. There is so much going on around the party that you're really introduced to a huge range of characters, and again, it is what is happening to them, which is where the importance, the potency of the Trails of Cold Steel narrative lies. There's another great analysis of one of the great historical novels, War and Peace, that I found in The Guardian, which likewise speaks to the appeal of Trails of Cold Steel as well. Again, I'll put the link to the full article in the description below, but an indicative quote that I would like to point to is this. "Tolstoy is not afraid to begin an episode with the throat clearing, here is how it came about," the kind of phrase we encounter in fairy tales. He is a great creator of palpable individuals, the little princess with her short upper lip and faint moustache, Pierre Bezukov, bumbling short-sightedly on the battlefield at Borodino, the old Prince Bolonsky, with his rages and his small dry hands, a shirtless Napoleon grunting to his valet who is brushing his fat back and hairy chest. Do it hard, keep going. But the Tolstoyan atmosphere often seems Homeric because of these highly particular characters essentially share simple, large, universal emotions: joy, shame, love, anger, fear, that might be easily transferred from one character to another. Trails of Cold Steel is like this too. The fantasy setting does lend it a fairy tale quality all in itself, and then each of the characters really drives home simple, near Aesop fable-like moral lessons. From the first game, with the bitter rivalry between the upper-class man and the one of humble origins, through to the way that conflict motivates the characters in the 4th chapter, Trails of Cold Steel uses its characters as a utility for its more broad thematic arguments. So, while it's right to say that the cast lacks the kind of in-depth development and time on screen as something like a Persona, where the entire goal of that game is to get you very deeply involved with the characters, that's a little like saying Trails of Cold Steel lacks because it doesn't have Super Mario Bros. Like platforming. It doesn't, of course, but that's not really the point of the game. By nature, these historical novels are long. War and Peace is infamous as the book people mention when they want to reference a really, really long book. And it's not even the longest. Romance of the Three Kingdoms, the full and unabridged version, absolutely dwarfs War and Peace, and it's nearly a library unto itself. However, unlike many games, this is never padding. Nothing's written into these great historical novels without it being there to further the core themes and ambitions of the novel. They are long by consequence rather than design, and ultimately that's why Trails of Cold Steel, in so effectively cribbing its themes and style from the historical novel, is also long but only by consequence. That is a huge shift when most video games, including in the JRPG genre, if they are long by design. There is a complete shift in how you think about them when you're trying to make a long game versus when you make a long game as a consequence of it needing to be so long. Anyhow, that is enough for this little thought bubble. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope it was interesting. Do let me know your thoughts in the comments, especially if you are a fan of the historical novel. I would love to know if you think that Trails is effective at taking this historical novel approach. Please do click that like and subscribe button so you'll be able to keep up with all the videos that we produce, and please do consider backing me on Patreon. Even $1 a month will be a huge assistance in helping me to continue to grow and expand what I am doing with this channel. Which of course benefits you, because then you'll get more videos and more interesting ones as I continue to find new and interesting things to do. Look forward to my review of Trails of Cold Steel 4 when I can figure out how to write something about it in a spoiler-free manner. And otherwise, get stuck into these games. I think that's the greatest point perhaps of all, and I've left it right to the last. If you do need to start from the very first Trails of Cold Steel, you can get them all on PlayStation 4 now. You can get the third and fourth one on the Switch, or maybe just the third with the fourth coming. But anyway, they are all available on modern consoles in one way or another, or on PC, and they are all very much worth it. This is a great series. Got all the time in the world for it. Really glad that it has finished as strongly as it has with Trails of Cold Steel 4, and it'll be interesting to see what they do next, whether they try and do something in line with what they have achieved with this series. Thanks as always for tuning in again, and we will see you at the next video.